Hi, it's Dennis Daly. If you've ever done much driving in California, you know you can't go anywhere really without being on an interstate. When the interstates came through, they sometimes skirted cities, but in the case of Banning, California, they cut the city in half. Years ago, I talked to a shop owner, Mark Hendren, about how his home, how Banning, California was really growing until it got scissored by the interstate system.
I've got a telephone book in the shop, 1946, and the front piece of it, it tells how Banning was the second largest growth community in California. Unfortunately, they don't say which one was number one, but we first came out here in 1959 on vacation. My aunt and uncle had lived here since the early 40s. And Banning was a bustling community. That was a cafe, that was a cafe, this was a dress shop, that was a dress shop, the theater was here. The whole width and breadth of Ramsey Street, from about 8th Street to the end of town, was all businesses, same as Livingston. Viable, good businesses. In about 63, 64, when they started building the freeway, basically what they did is they took Livingston, which was one of the main thoroughfares, and just cut it off. The buildings that were there on both sides of Livingston were taken down, and they cut the town in half. That had a major impact. I think one of the things that it facilitated was the fact that prior to the freeway, it was relatively difficult to go out of Banning. You had to get in a car, you had to drive a 2-lane road to wherever you wanted to go. Well, the freeway allowed you to get on the freeway and speed to the next largest town, which at that time would have been Riverside or San Bernardino. And so the downtown gradually became less viable as a retail center, because the people that had the businesses were dying off. They were selling the businesses off. People that were probably not real capable of running a business. Customer would come in, they would be treated what they thought was shabby. They'd go to Riverside to buy their product.
Yeah, a part and parcel in that is you now had an alternative to shopping here.
Exactly, and the alternative, I personally think, is what made a big difference in the way our downtown grew.
Now, I wonder why no one questioned the fact that the interstate was put so close, it had encroached so much. I mean, you see cities where it's some distance. It's a mile from downtown. It kind of swoops around. It's almost as if either no one had any clout here. I mean, maybe it's hard in retrospect to figure out why, but it really, as you say, came up against the downtown section.
I think that, truth be known, the council at that time, like a lot of city councils that I've dealt with, they don't have the foresight to look to the future. They saw the immediate benefit to them, which would have been more people coming to town because the freeway was there. They didn't realize that the downside of that was if you can get to town, you can get out of town easier. So they pretty much welcomed it with open arms. When the original freeway was built, there was only, I believe, 2 off-ramps to the freeway. And then later on, they put in more. They've always questioned why there wasn't an on-ramp, off-ramp at San Antonio, which was the main drag of the city. Why didn't they put one there? Who knows? As I said earlier, I think that, there might have been some type of scheme to, destroy a bunch of little towns. 2 years ago, we took a trip back east, and it seems like all the new freeways purposely skirted the towns. I don't know if that was economic, because it would have been cheaper to go outside of town and build a freeway rather than buy up commercial property and put a road in. But they definitely did not do that in Banning. And you can go to a lot of communities in Southern California and see that they were destroyed by putting the freeway through. You lost your identity of your community. You took groups of people that were historically cohesive and cut them in half by putting a freeway through them.
We have a neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia, that is literally almost impossible to get to now. There was a new connector to make the Dulles International Airport a half an hour closer to downtown. And in putting in this connector, they cut through an area with but a single underpass to get there. Home values have dropped. It's as if the people live on an island out there now.
And you see that quite often in California also. Now they're trying to remedy that by putting more off-ramps in, but then you have this, urban upheaval once again where they have to relocate families and things like that. And in California, it's extremely expensive, to buy up the property, to relocate the homes. But prior to the freeway going through, with Highway 99 and Highway 60 coming right through the middle of town, it was a bustling metropolis. I mean, there was a lot of service-oriented businesses. You can still see evidence of the gas stations that were here, the hotels that were here. There was a large number of hotels, and this was pretty much the midway point for going any place, it seems like. Plus, you go back 90 years ago, Banning was a jump-off point for the mountains, the healthy environment in the mountains. There was a sanitarium in town for
tuberculosis, that type of thing?
I believe more asthmatics than it was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was still sort of a scary concept to have.
But at that time, you came out here for the air, unlike what some people would say now.
Yeah. Well, the air, the water, the weather. We're up about 2,500 feet, so it stays relatively cool here. This is before Palm Springs was ever thought of as being a community, for the wealthy. And quite a few influential people stayed in the Pass area. Irving Berlin wrote the song White Christmas in Banning. There's rumors that Einstein spent time in the city of Banning and was known to comment that it was the most beautiful spot on earth that he'd ever lived in. The theater across the street, which was built in the 20s, showed and still shows first-run movies. And a lot of the movie stars that were in the movies would come to Banning sort of incognito to see themselves because they were feared of being mobbed in L.A. at the premieres, so they would come out here and see themselves on the screen without fear of being mobbed by their fans. A lot of very, very interesting historical things took place in the Pass area.
Well, now, I don't know whether those listening at home were able to hear it, but there was a train went through, and the highway, the interstate, paralleled the tracks, which is very reminiscent of the I-66 right-of-way in Arizona. That was the way that both the railroad engineers and the highway engineers figure was the most economical way to get through the area. Is there passenger service? Is it all freight? What was it like when you were a child? Was rail important here?
I can't remember it being important. We never went any place on the train, but there was a train station in town. And at one time, a lot of...
It's a load of cement blocks if I've ever seen one.
Yeah. We have a factory here in town that makes cement blocks. At one time, a lot of passengers came through the Pass area, especially like during the war. There was, Patton's encampment out in the desert east of here, and tens of thousands of troops passed through here. We still have a rail service coming through. In fact, there's plans of putting a rail center here. I don't know if it'll ever come to fruition, but it would be a natural for our area because we are centrally located to a lot of different things. In the 1850s, when Washington came out with a survey party looking for an access route for a railroad, this was the area he picked. This was written up as the area to come through. 25 years later, when they actually brought the railroad through, this is the way it came. And you're right, naturally the railroad wants the least amount of declination to travel over. It would be the easiest place to put a freeway, and they paralleled the freeway. It splits off in certain areas, and they reused some of the existing better road bed to build the freeway, with where Highway 10 splits off and goes to the Yucaipa-Calamasa area. That wasn't much of a road 70 years ago. It's become a major thoroughfare. You're right. We have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cars pass by every day. And I think that's part of the problem. They pass by. They don't get off.
Well, my hometown in southern Indiana is on US 50. which was never made an interstate, carries an enormous amount of traffic, though, between Cincinnati and St. Louis. And about 10 years ago, a friend of mine said, guess what? We're getting a 4-lane bypass here. And he was so excited. Well, they build the bypass, and he said, no one comes through town anymore. And I said, Rodney, look up the word bypass in the dictionary.
It's interesting when you go back into that area. They have feeder roads that go through the smaller communities, but invariably they're a goodly distance from the freeway. So I don't know, I guess you would have to ask yourself, which is more amenable to business. Do you bypass it and run the risk of nobody coming, or do you put it through losing half of your business property and making it easier for the people to leave? So I guess it's a sort of a vicious cycle that you get into. But
Mark, Banning is very representative of a lot of towns along an interstate, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this segment. For example, my listeners know that I was in a town called Seligman, Arizona. I was talking about US 66, and I interviewed a fellow at a gas station. His father had owned it before him, and he said the night before the interstate opened, they had a party because they knew it would be a little different. But he said the next morning when they opened up the interstate, rather than this bumper-to-bumper jam of cars, he had 2 customers that day from out of town.
Yeah, I think that's probably, to a certain extent, the way it is, because the downtown has been passed by with off-ramps, that where you do see an area with an off-ramp, like 22nd Street. 22nd Street has an off-ramp. At one time, the AM/PM gas station there was the busiest gas station in the whole AM/PM chain by a bunch. It still is very, very busy. I know in the mid-'60s, my father tried to secure a McDonald's franchise for Banning. McDonald's, because they will not put in a store without a built-in clientele, refused to do it. Their McDonald's here is one of the busiest McDonald's in the whole chain. But it's right off the off-ramp, and, everything is right there. The people get off, they get gas, they eat, they get back on and go on. And it seems like one of the places they go to is Colorado River for recreational purposes. And this is the midway point between Orange County, Los Angeles, and the river, so...
Well, you have a similar situation if you're going from the Los Angeles area to Vegas. Barstow is kind of where you want to stop and get your soft drink and maybe make a pit stop. And there's a huge McDonald's and a bunch of old railroad cars there carrying the railroad tradition there. That midway point is very important. My hometown, I mentioned in Indiana, is exactly halfway between Cincinnati and St. Louis. Grew up around a railroad refueling center, and they put it there on purpose.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Barstow. Barstow has the busiest McDonald's in the world. They flip more hamburgers there than any other McDonald's. And it is. I mean, people, we're going to go to Vegas, we're going to meet somebody. Well, we'll meet at the McDonald's in Barstow. Everybody knows where it's at. It's pretty interesting. And Banning, is somewhat like that, except the amount of cars going through, they're not going quite as far. I mean, once you get to Barstow, that's pretty much it till you get to Vegas, unless you want to stop at Baker. But there, there's still a lot of communities in between here and the river that you could stop at. Banning happens to be Banning and Beaumont happen to be the only 2 that are directly on the freeway. But what they've done is they've taken some of the major intersections, major off-ramps, and put gas station complexes, Indian Avenue, places like that. So, they're still fueling areas, but...
Is that most of the economy then in this city is service to the interstate traveler?
I don't believe so. Obviously mine isn't. I don't see that many businesses that are oriented towards that type of a business. We have a lot of hotels which stay pretty busy from what I know. I have a lot of customers that come from out of the area that, they know my business, they know the quality of service, and it's not a big hassle for them to jump in the car and drive 25 or 30 miles. Growing up in Michigan, we never went anyplace. It took forever to go 20 miles. Out here, it's not. I mean, we have a lot of people visit us primarily from Europe. And for them to, we'll go into L.A., we'll go into San Bernardino. To them, this is just unheard of, to drive 100 kilometers to go see a movie to them is just, you don't do that. I mean,
well, and the other thing people who grew up in urban areas don't realize, that for those of us who grew up in the Midwest, or certainly in the Rockies or the West, it's not unusual to have to drive 3 hours to get to an airport. Some people can become so spoiled to their proximity to transportation.
Well, I know the little town I lived in Germany, I would think would have been like Banning was 40 years ago. Everything was here. You didn't have to leave. I mean, any product that you wanted would have been for sale in that town, and Banning was like that. In the mid-'60s, my parents owned a furniture business. At one time, there were 7 furniture stores in our town. 5 years later, there were 3. We owned 2 of them. At one time, there was probably 20-plus places to eat, and no there was, depending on what you consider fast food, maybe 1 or 2 fast food restaurants, home-owned fast food drive.
One of a kind, mom and pop, not a chain.
Exactly. And they were all busy. We had several places that sold men and women's clothing, several shoe stores. Right now, we basically have none of those things. I don't know if the buyer's mentality is such that they need to go out of town.
Well, there's something about that psyche. For example, I've mentioned my hometown too many times on the show. Vincennes, Indiana is 30 minutes away.
Well, we haven't run into that problem. That's sort of a sore spot with me. But the psyche part, yeah, I think you're right. You have to, people want to go someplace. They use the excuse of shopping as a reason to go someplace, because it is easy. I mean, if it was a fact that you had to go on a 2-lane road to get someplace, I don't think they would be as amenable to leaving. But you talk about experts. We have these people come to town, and over the years that I've been involved in the city, a lot of them. And we did it this way in Long Beach, or we did it this place in Podunk, or no, you don't understand. This doesn't work in Banning. I mean, I don't know why. I don't know if it's in the water or in the air, but all these grand wall plans that they've laid have never really truly come to fruition, because Banning's unique in that respect. I know I've been in business almost 20 years. I consider myself to be relatively successful, and it's plod. You got to just plod away. You try to plan as much for the future as possible, but you have to stick with the program each and every day, and you don't want to vary too much from it.
Isn't there, in a way, though, a psychological advantage to being now off the beaten track, that the businesses don't have an automatic audience, that you went into a specialty field that's drawing people not off the interstate because they don't know you're here, no big sign, you're 2 blocks from the highway, but yet the people from miles around know that you have a one-of-a-kind gun shop, that you're knowledgeable, and that you're making a living because you found a niche and you found your own audience here.
I hopefully that's true. Like I said, I have a lot of customers that come from out of the area because they do know. And you're right, I don't do the big billboards, I don't do the television or radio advertising. I've tried it, but I find that my best advertising is a satisfied customer. It's hard to explain to some people that being downtown, owning my own building, my overhead is considerably lower than somebody that's in a mall or in a standalone strip center, where they're paying several $1,000s a month mortgage or lease on their building. They have to charge more. I'm not pressured by corporate headquarters to push a certain type of firearm. I'm not pressured by corporate headquarters, to do a lot of the things that some of these larger chain gun shops do. Conversely, I buy from the same people they're buying from. I buy a lot of times in the same quantities they're buying. So the pricing isn't a whole lot of difference. It's to me, it's interesting. I've had people come in my shop, look at what I had for sale, go someplace else and buy it, come back to me for advice. And to me, that's, sort of a retarded attitude to have, but it happens, and it happens not too frequently, but frequently enough to sometimes make me wonder, what are these people doing buying guns? But you're absolutely right. My niche is such that there's nobody around that has the same type of a store that I do. I've been playing with guns for a long time. And one of the things when I opened my shop up, I said to myself, what don't the other gun shops have? I've been in thousands of gun shops. What don't they have? And one of the things that none of them ever have were chairs. Never go into a gun shop with a chair. First thing I put in my shop, put in chairs. If the people want to come in, sit down and talk for a while, they're welcome to it. And it's more the old time, down-home atmosphere. A lot of my longtime customers jokingly say I should put in a potbelly stove and a Cracker Barrel, so we can sit around and discuss the ills of the world and the city, in comfort. I have people that come in my shop 2-3 times a week, never buy anything. Just come in, talk for a while, leave, go home, and vegetate, come back, and some of these guys, I suspect their life revolves around my gun shop, which is sort of scary. But there's a lot of really interesting people that come in, a lot of extremely intelligent people come in, and there's a lot of good conversations that go on in our shop. A lot of silly ones, but there's always going to be that segment of our society coming in and wanting to be silly.
I mentioned to Mark that of all the things Banning had, the one thing I noticed it didn't have was parking meters.
That's true. In fact, the Downtown Business Association a year or so ago petitioned the city, and the city acquiesced to putting time requirements downtown. I guess it sort of reflects on the mentality of the business owner. Several downtown business owners would park right in front of their store all day long. So their customers had no place to park, and we wanted to redress that problem. So what we did is we went to the city. They were already putting together a parking plan. We went in and gave them our input, and so now we have 1 hour parking downtown, which gives everybody a whack at getting a chance to park, walking in. There's some off-street parking, nowhere near is enough, but it was better than either parking there all day long or having 15 or 20 minute parking.
I don't want to open a Pandora's box, particularly if your answer is negative in this, but I would think one of the advantages, and heavens, there are so many for not living in an urban area, but one of the advantages of being in a city of 20,000 or so is that maybe you can't change local government, but by golly, you can get somebody to listen, that you have access, that you know who these people are, that you're eating at the lunchroom with them.
I think if people realize the value of that, to me, the ability to sit out here like we're doing now, people going by and waving at me and things like that. If I've been relatively involved in local government for a lot of reasons. My dad used to be mayor of town, and we have right now probably one of the most user-friendly city governments we've ever had. That's very definitely true. If you have a problem in a town our size, the makeup of our city government, you can get somebody to listen to you and invariably help you. It used to be, they'd listen to you, but then they wouldn't do nothing about it. But I feel very fortunate. Most of the police officers I know, the firemen, most of city employees, I know they know me. If I have a problem, they'll take care of it. And it's not just me. I have people come in and tell me, we moved to town 3 months ago. I had a problem with my water meter. I called the city, and they were out that day and fixed it. And when I lived in Orange County, heck, it would have taken a month to get it done, And the only thing I can say is, aren't you glad you moved to Banning? And, people are realizing that you can come to this town and buy a darn nice house for a third of what it would cost you in Orange County, and you're still only an hour away from Orange County.
For example, what I'm paying in rent, were I back home in Indiana, I could probably rent 4 pretty decent houses for that.
Or own 4 pretty decent houses. It's interesting to me because when we did go back east, I looked in the paper, I saw the price of houses and stuff, and people are always telling me, I'm moving back to Oklahoma, I'm moving back to Indiana, I'm moving to Arizona. Arizona's a big spot to move to. Oh, it's cheaper back there, blah, blah, blah. It's not. It's not. You can come to Banning, you can buy a house, a nice house, anywhere from $35,000, $40,000 up to a couple $100,000. And when you start looking at that type of money, how much leftover income do you have to have fun with? I know you go into Orange County, $300,000 for a house, you're spending your whole paycheck for a mortgage. You don't have time to have any fun. Out here, you can own a house, and you can still have money left over to have fun with. And that's been, to me, a very fortunate occurrence because I do own several pieces of property. And I couldn't have done it, if I would have lived in a larger urban area. If I want to go someplace, if I want to go up to the mountains, or if I want to go to the beach, if I want to go to Vegas, you're only, a few hours away. And I've never found it to be a problem living in Banning if I want to go someplace. If I want to go into LA. Last week we had a young lady come to visit us from Germany. We take an exchange student summertime. Hour and 10 minutes to the airport. We come back home, and it's like the difference between night and day. You don't have a zillion cars out there. You don't have the pollution. We're sitting outside now. It's probably, 90 degrees outside.
But the air is fresh. I've noticed that. I was over in Palm Springs, and I felt as if I were in an oven.
Yeah. Well, there's an inversion layer that goes over the pass that sort of blows the smog into the desert. It sort of bypasses us. Our water comes directly out of the mountains, nice and fresh. In fact, I can remember when there was a big controversy in the city of Banning over chlorinating our water. We don't have to chlorinate our water. The government says we have to, and there was a lot of controversy. I mean, albeit a tempest in a teapot, but there were a lot of people that were very, very concerned that we had to put evil chemicals in our ultra-pure water.
Oh, there were some violent discussions. I mean, all the way from people saying if God had wanted chlorine in the water, he would have put it, or she would have put it there.
Very, very reminiscent of about 30 years ago in our community, Damn it, you can't put that stuff in our water. It'll kill our kids. It'll make their brains rot, But even now that they do have to, obviously, federal law says you have to, that you never taste it. I mean, I've been in the communities where you could not drink the water. It tasted so bad. We actually have people that come to Banning. I have a friend of mine in the desert. He'll come to Banning and fill up water bottles at my tap in my yard. My dad, who grew up in a very small community in Alabama, and through the Depression era and stuff like that, basically was in a service-oriented retail business. One of the many things he passed on to me was this concept that you have the right to complain. That's a God-given right in our country to complain. Lord knows a lot of people do. But conversely, it's not fair to be part of the problem without being willing to be part of the solution. Anybody can complain. I mean, it doesn't take any kind of rocket scientist mentality to go, well, our schools are terrible and I'm going to take my kids someplace else. The people that invents that to me is, well, what have you done to make the schools better? What have you gone and talked to your children's teachers? Have you gone and talked to the superintendent of schools? And this is not to say that our schools are bad. I graduated with honors from Banning High. I consider myself to be a relatively intelligent person. My son the same way. He graduated with honors. We have an inordinate number of graduates from our town that go on to colleges and maintain super grade point averages. But I think the one key is to become involved. If it's neighborhood watch, if it's just being friendly with your immediate neighbors, if it's going for the school board, running for city council, being in the Chamber of Commerce, you have to involve yourself in it. Because if you're not only do you lose control, but you also lose the insight that it takes to make intelligent decisions. Occasionally, not too often in a town like Banning, but occasionally a proposition will come up for vote. Tax proposal, bond proposal, build a city hall, things like this. And there's so many misconceptions of what it entails because most people don't spend the time to read into it. I've been all over the world. I've been very fortunate that I've had a chance to interact with people from many, many different countries, and I find that the one commonality is everybody wants to be an individual in their own space.
Well, Mark Hendon, thanks for spending the time. I've learned two things, and that is small towns like Banning, California can work if enough good people stick together and make it work. And now I know where Irving Berlin wrote White Christmas.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. So now you're smarter than most people of the world, and you can go forth and tell everybody that White Christmas was written here.
Mark, thanks a lot.
Glad to.
A city cut in half. Banning, California. I'm Dennis Daly.